Hi, welcome, Hans.
Hey, Ram, I cannot hear Hans.
Yeah, I'm just checking with him to unmute himself.
Okay.
Hans is having some technical issues. Can you just wait for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Unmute. Hello, everyone. I'm Hans Volkers, founder at IBEC. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar for Artificial Intelligence for Health and Life Science. I would like to introduce the speaker of today, Mrs. Hima Khamrai. She's currently serving as the director for sorry.
We can hear you, Hans. Please go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Something goes wrong at my end. It is. Sorry, Hima has been with Intel. Hima has been with Intel for 16 years, and the past 5 years in AI for health and life sciences. She holds a master's degrees from the University of Washington and health science degrees from Stanford University. Thank you, Hima Khamrai, for joining us. I invite you to start your presentation now, please.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm really glad to be here. And for the next few minutes, here is how I'm thinking I'll go through. I'll start with a snapshot of the health and life sciences sector, and then I'll move into sharing a few examples on AI. And then I'll touch a little bit about AI and COVID before I call it a wrap. So that's the outline, and so let me get started. Now I'm having difficulty. Okay, here we go. So in terms of state of healthcare, I just wanted to share this for all because we all can relate to the challenges when it comes to health and life sciences because we're all key stakeholders in terms of the quality, the cost, and access. These are universal challenges that we see across any country. You can see some of the same issues. And so when you look at costs, so let me start with costs, right? The costs, these are numbers from 2019, 7.8 trillion T with a trillion with a T. So we are spending quite a lot of money in terms of our healthcare system, and it's forecasted to kind of really almost go towards 18 trillion sometime in 2030. So the question then is, if we're spending all this money, are we really being all healthy, and do we have a great healthcare system? And I'm sure you'll agree with me that especially now with the pandemic, it's been really very obvious. We're woefully inadequate in terms of our systems and our public health infrastructure. So no, we are not healthy. And to unfortunate is that the chronic disease, which is, this is like, something we've been dealing with, is even before COVID, it has been the leading cause of deaths, almost 73% worldwide. And so we have a large sickness burden. We have soaring costs, and also the world is going silver. We are aging, we are living longer. And so then what that means is that we need people to kind of care for us as we age. And therein is the also challenge in terms of the caregiver shortage. And this number is from the WHO, the shortage of healthcare professionals by 2030. So these are in a snapshot. These are the problems that we face within the health sector. So we need tools. We as the health community need tools, and AI is a powerful tool. And let me share with you, where can AI help in terms of health, our health sector? So let me start with data. because data is a prerequisite for AI. And so we are like any other any other sector out there. Health sector is generating a lot of data. And when you think about IoT and edge compute, we will be generating more data at the edge. And so as a sector, we're already generating more than 30% of the world's data happens to be health related. And
Aye.
go ahead. Was there a question?
Sorry?
Was there a question, Hans? Did you? Okay, I'll keep moving. So healthcare, we have a lot of data, but the question then is, how much of this are we really using as insights? And the truth is, less than 3% of this data is really put to work. And so in some sense, we are data rich and insights poor because we're really not using much of this data to kind of in any meaningful way. And so that's where AI can be this tool to kind of move the needle when it comes to data, converting it into insights so it can really benefit the clinicians and the patients. So moving on to the next challenge is something that I touched on in the beginning, is about the clinician shortage, and that's a big problem. And some of the studies that we have seen talk about how AI can really address some of that the gap that we have in terms of clinicians, and do much and some more. In beyond addressing the gap, it can also address some unmet demand. And the third one that I want to talk about is the drug development. Now, drug development is one area that really needs some disruption. I'm sure you would agree, because this it's not sustainable, because the cost and the time involved in developing a drug, it's like $22.5 billion on average per drug, and 8 to 10 years on average per drug is what the data has been. And if we could cut that by 50% for these studies that we have seen, I think we would be making a lot of changes into the challenges that we saw in the previous foil. So I think this area is kind of, I think there's a lot of great work that's happening, which I'll touch in the next couple of foils. But these are some areas that AI could help. And so let me then step into a few examples that we have had firsthand experience working with our customers and partners. And so let me go through them. First is, the predictive solutions using classic machine learning, the statistical methods. I mean, these are examples not from anything recent. These solutions have been in place for a while, because with all the investments in analytics, it has helped us to kind of get prepared for the providing this predictive solutions in across all the three domains: clinical, operational, financial, some more than others. But essentially there are solutions for predictive solutions for predictive analytics across the board. And so I'll pick a couple examples here. On the clinical side, the pen medicine is an example I want to talk about. Pen medicine, they were looking at the two main conditions that they were looking at, and that is most costly for them, is sepsis and heart failure. So those are the two conditions they were looking at. And sepsis is one that I would kind of I'm pretty sure most of the hospitals in the US have some kind of sepsis related solution. Sepsis is like a hospital acquired infection, and deadly. And so the solution that Penn Medicine put together was that they can detect 30 hours before the onset of the infection. So that's a big deal in terms of the patient outcome and costs and the clinician burden. And on the operational side, there are many examples, think about, readmissions or even the clinician workflow. And the example here I wanted to talk about was the Sharp Healthcare. We've worked with them on predictive analytic solutions, and the one that they felt was helping them was around um, the rapid response teams that they had to kind of put in place for as the patient declines and they need emergency care. They had to kind of streamline their resources and staff and get the rapid response teams in place. And so the predicting 1 hour before the decline happens, right, is something that they thought that was very helpful in kind of streamlining the resources. But there are operational is one place that we could do a lot more. And there are many examples already. And then on the financial side, it's like any other sector, we have fraud and waste abuse in the system, and that's where we have seen a lot of work on AI. And one of our customers actually used it for revenue cycle management to increase the revenue and cut costs. And so I just wanted to kind of share with you there are things that are happening when it comes to predictive analytics already across the different domains. What is new has been the deep learning. Now, deep learning, it's not quite as new in the sense that this is, again, I'm talking about, since 2017, we have seen a lot of pickup in many of the deep learning solutions, and I have a few examples here. But because deep learning has been very helpful in terms of the unstructured data, because if you think about health sector, it's around 80% of the data is unstructured. It's the text, it's the images, it's the genomic data, and now digital pathology. So there are unstructured data, and so deep learning has been very helpful to kind of look at the unstructured data. And so the first example on the left-hand side I have is where we work with Scripps Institute and kind of looked at different data sets, the EHR records, the electronic health records, and also looking at genetic variants. Because usually when you look at a clinical risk prediction, sometimes, it's a little bit late. It's before the onset of a disease. So looking at combining it with the genetic data set could kind of give us some more earlier indications. And so that was the ability, right, to look at data within the genomic information. And so this was a very simple model. It was a multi-layer perceptron, but essentially this was used to kind of say, okay, we have a traditional way of looking at predicting the disease for a cardiovascular patient, a cardiovascular disease risk. How do we do with relative to deep learning? And with deep learning, we are able to identify 23 new patients who are at risk and were not identified through the previous method. So what we felt was that, with the genomic data, there's a lot of hidden data that deep learning was able to pull. So, and then moving to the next example, this is about medical imaging. And actually, I'll stop for a minute before I get into the example here, and I would say a bit about medical imaging, because I feel like that is a bright spot when it comes to deep learning. It's almost like a perfect storm where you have this right technology that is, and the ecosystem is ready to absorb it. And that was what we saw with medical imaging. Whether it's a large company like GE, Siemens, Philips, or as a innovative startup companies, they all are really using deep learning for medical imaging. And if you think about any device category, whether it's an X-ray or an ultrasound or MRI or CT, and so on, every one of them have I've seen through the work that there has been some innovation. Like, at the point of screening, you can have if a person with a collapsed lung is going through the X-ray, you can kind of flag that at the point of screening. And so that level of intelligence has been added into many of these devices. So that's a very exciting space when I talk about medical imaging. So let me go back to the example here. So the example here is about the scale, right? When you're talking about the gap that I mentioned in the beginning, where you have a huge gap when it comes to clinicians and the people that they serve, right? You're talking about thousands of radiologists looking at a billion population. That's just unfeasible to think that they can be cared for. And so this is a lung nodule detection. Actually, this was a thyroid nodule detection. This example, and what this was able to do was, if you have 70% of the patients do not have to be seen by the physician because of the screening, and they are kind of seen as not at risk, then the physician can focus on the rest of the 30%. And that seems more doable. And that is the scale that we were able to kind of see with this solution. It's a very simple solution, but it really went a long way in terms of kind of bridging that gap that we have talked about. And then there is the drug discovery, which I said, which is something that we should look at in terms of disruption. And this is an example of high content screening. High content screening, it's a process in the drug discovery methods. And what that entails is, you're looking at millions of compounds and how they interact, what is their effect on cells, right? And so you're looking for identifying these cellular phenotypes from this whole microscopy images. And it's been very challenging because, the feature engineering, right, is it's with the regular machine learning has been tough, and so deep learning has been helpful, but there are so many more complexities in here. If you think of the size of the microscopy images, it's like 10,000 by 45,000 pixels. So you're looking at large images, and sometimes it is really for a human eye to kind of catch some of these patterns is harder. And so people are looking at different kinds of networks. And this one was from Novartis. They came up with a multi-scale CNN network that has been very helpful. And what essentially we tried to do is, besides scale and cost, was more the speed of like the compression of the time that's required in kind of making progress. And so I would call out on the compression of time that has been helpful. And there are other examples that I could talk about, like I don't have it here, but I would say if you were to Google a halicin, HALICIN, it's a compound that has been developed for addressing the issue around antibiotic resistance, right? The superbugs. And the MIT scientist who was involved with this project said that he had to look at 107 million compounds. And ideally, it would have taken him around 14 years. Okay. And think about the compression of time where you're taking 14 years is what it would have taken, but it took him less than a few months or even weeks, right, when they were done with that. So it's just that compression of time is what I wanted to focus on when we talk about drug discovery. And there is many more examples, especially if you look at all the innovative startups. So I'll stop here in terms of examples, and I kind of move to the next topic in terms of COVID, right? Because if AI could do so many things, then why did not AI, rescue us from COVID? I mean, this was kind of the sentiment. If you look, people who are looking at AI and COVID, that was the feeling, is that why did we not see this magic happen, right? And the truth is, yes, there is some hype. AI is going through some hype, and so there is that sense of disillusionment, right? But what is more important is to understand that AI is not a magic wand. It needs a lot of things in place before AI can be applied, right? It's with data. You need to have balanced data sets, representative data sets, quality data sets, annotations, and that's just with data. And then you have the infrastructure, talent, and so on. So without having all that, we cannot expect AI to work, right? So it's just that, it feels, we have to be, we have to look at the whole context, right, of what takes for AI to happen. But as an enthusiast, if you ask me, and there are some examples where we have worked closely with our partners. So AI has helped COVID, and here are some examples. When you think about disinfecting, this is one basic example, right, where disinfecting robots using computer vision have been very helpful. In this case, what you're seeing is, cleaning down the machines after every use take hours. So that has been helpful. And then if you think about telehealth, we have seen the 1,000% jump, right, in terms of telehealth, just streamlining that to allow for for patients to see their physicians in spite of COVID has been helpful there. It's played a role. And the third one is the medical imaging, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of great work across the board had been done in the past, and it was the speed with which the companies could then put out the COVID models, and especially when the testing was an issue, companies in South Korea some of the ones were very fast in terms of getting through the COVID models and then putting it through the regulatory framework and such. So there are so many examples on medical imaging, and then there is the remote monitoring, the virtual ICUs, and then the last two I would say is more around drug repurposing, right? Drug repurposing is one thing that like the Halison that I talked about, that was also drug repurposing. But here, if you will remember dexamethasone and remdesivir, they were also drugs that were designed and approved for a different purpose, like inflammation, asthma, and Ebola, and those drugs were repurposed, right? So this notion of doing an in silico method, right, for doing things before they go into in vivo and the in vitro and then in vivo. So I think drug repurposing, AI has played a role. And if you think about Moderna, the vaccine, you should look up their AI factory, right? How they go from designing the sequence to optimizing it, and all of they have AI processes to kind of compress their R&D cycles. So a lot of things are happening. So if you ask a person like me who's kind of following this and kind of working with the industry, AI is really doing a lot of great work already, right? But then again, there's another button here, because people are concerned. If anything, the COVID has shown is the concern around, AI can kind of put in reinforced bias and amplify bias. And the truth is, yes, that can happen, because, but the question is that it's not AI. It's about everything that I mentioned. It's about the people who are building it, and what's the process to remedy if something goes wrong, what is the infrastructure in place, what are the systems, and I put in systems here for a reason, because some of these systems, especially in the US, they have been for decades now, and there are embedded guidance that are fed into the systems that are being propagated, right? So American Medical Association just last week called out EGFR. It's like a code for determining kidney diseases. So when it came to people of minority, it would look at a kidney and call it healthy when it was not. So there are embedded codes that we have to relook at it. So that we have to look at the systems, and then we have to look at the data security, privacy, governance, all of that. And then, of course, algorithm fairness, right? I mean, people who had good intentions have also, seen that the wrong outcome. So this design for AI for good is something we've been talking about. I think we need to pay more attention now, and find ways to kind of minimize harm. And I think it has put to the forefront for us to all think about that, because And I'm pretty optimistic, because as a person who has looked at AI and see the powerful, how powerful AI can be, but I also understand that if it is not used in a design in the right way, it can cause harm. But as a community, we could be working towards making AI, create a foundation for the future of AI in medicine. And we need for this not just the AI enthusiasts or AI developers. It requires the healthcare providers to be involved. It requires the policymakers to be involved. It requires the social scientists to be involved. It requires the patients to be involved. So if we can find that medium where we can collaborate and kind of look at this and design AI for good, I think AI will go a long way in solving many of the challenges I laid out in the first foil. We can address many of those challenges and have a better outcome for all of us. So that's a wrap for my presentation. So, and I'm glad to kind of answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Hema. We have Mohammad Raghib. He's asking to name us the companies which are currently working on healthcare solutions which you put out. Can you name a few companies?
Yeah. So, when we, I mentioned to you about medical imaging, right? So when we started looking at it, say around 2016, around the time, we looked at which are the areas that are kind of adopting AI sooner than others, right? And it was medical imaging. And so the names that I mentioned to you, excuse me, are clearly like, GE, Siemens, Philips, all of the big, we call them GPS, but the big three, which account for 80% of the market, right? They're all of them have, are working seriously on many of these solutions. And then you have startup communities, and that's where, you see a lot of innovation. I don't know if any of you attend the radiology conference in Chicago in 2019 when I attended. There is so much of innovation happening across all the different geographies, and there's one company called JKL Inspection, and they have like 34 models and 14 covering 14 body parts. I mean, it's amazing how much they are pushing through. I mean, it obviously has to go through the regulatory framework before it, to kind of to make sure that these are the right models to be used. But there is a lot of innovation happening in startup companies, and that is for medical imaging, right? But then if you move into the drug development, right? Companies, all the big companies that have been now involved in developing the vaccines, right? And Novartis was one we worked with. We have seen a lot of innovation within Novartis, but then think of Pfizer or Merck and all of the pharmaceutical companies have some work happening already in this space, right? So, and then I would just ask to keep an eye on the startup communities, even there, Atomwise, Benevolent AI, and then now we are talking about digital pathology. So pathology has always been like, you have the microscopic slices, right? And now they're going through the digitization process. And so digital pathology is going to be a very key area to look at. And so that's what I would say is, medical imaging companies, pharma companies, and then of course the EHR companies who are kind of looking at all the electronic health records like Epic, Cerner, and then the and the startup community for sure.
We have Narsima asking like, which are the companies which are effectively using AI in revenue cycle management, and he wanted more information on that.
I think I'm gonna mess that name up, but I think again here also there's a lot of startup companies. I think it was Conasis is the company that we worked with. I can, yeah, I'll make sure I drop the name in the chat here in a few, but there's also startup companies in revenue cycle management that are doing AI. It just doesn't, it doesn't ring a bell. So that's something I can follow up. I think it's Conasis, but let me check for sure.
Okay, we have a doctor here, Snehashish Chowdhury. He says, I'm an optometrist and recently started to learn data science. How do you see AI helping in early detection of diabetic retinopathy or glaucoma, which is considered a leasing cause for blindness? So how much is clinicians' involvement in AI and data analytics?
Oh, super question. And thank you, Dr. Sneh, for that question, because I think, that's one project that we have worked very closely with, and that's also an area I'm very passionate about, because I work with a nonprofit called Shankarai Foundation. It's a big hospital network system in India, and we did a project with them just recently. And I'll also send Ram the information about the work that we have done with them. They developed a model for diabetic retinopathy, because early screening is the name of the game, right? And especially with diabetes kind of impacting, almost 90 million plus by 2030, just in India, right? So I think that's a place we should focus. And not just for diabetic retinopathy, it's basically, I'm learning that with retina, there is so many more ailments that we could be identifying. Even there is a talk about even Alzheimer's. There may be some early warnings that we can find by just looking at retina. So I think there is I will share that information of a model that has already been created. It's a cloud-based model, and we're trying to see if we can kind of put it into an edge device that we can use to make that early screening happen at the patient premises. But to your question on whether optometrists can be involved, I think that would be the best combination, is because where I have seen things really work is people who can bridge that the clinician capability with the data science capability, right? That we need both of them. And if you're able to kind of, and we have people that I work with who have got both, and they bring a lot of value to this discussion. Now, at some point, right, like, I think this is you may have heard of it. People were so worried about, will AI kind of replace radiologists? And the truth is, no, it won't replace radiologists, but it will replace radiologists who don't know how to apply AI. So that's kind of the thing that goes, because eventually the curriculum has to include the radiologists need to understand how to use AI, not develop it mostly, but use. But if you're into developing it, then you're in the right place. I think there'll be much value for somebody who can understand both the domains.
Thank you, ma'am.
Go ahead.
No, but that's it. I just wanted to.
Okay. Thank you.
To know all the answers.
Hi, good morning. One question. What does AI mean for the skill requirements for the health professionals?
What does AI mean for skills requirement for health professionals? Okay, so in terms of, when we talk about the development, right, like understanding how to interpret, right, like the results, right? I mean, developing is one thing, to understand, what kinds of methods do we apply for AI, right? Some things, it may be an overkill to use deep learning. So AI is also evolving, right? So to keep abreast of what's happening, whether it's classic machine learning or whether it's deep learning. Next, we are seeing more about the the cognitive AI. So so AI is evolving. So just understanding which of these methods will work for what you're trying to do is one thing, but more importantly, as a clinician, understanding how to interpret this, right? How to look at what the AI results mean to your work, right? Like some things are the AI is getting to a point where it is almost similar to what you would see in a regular report, right? Like a radiology report. So it's kind of generating reports to a point where you may not need additional info. I mean, it doesn't need an additional skill, but I would say, there is still room for, better interpretation of the results that are produced by AI. How to kind of interpret the results is one area that requires some more work, and um, that's what I would say, is that's the place. Besides understanding, I mean, without going to the details of understanding everything about AIs, the different networks, different methods, and how to apply it. If that is not where you want to focus, and if you just want to focus on the normal the clinician workflow, I think it would be the interpretation.
We have a question from Atharva. I guess you covered it. He's asking, how will AI be helpful in drug screening during the drug development stages?
Yeah, I think no, it's just the enormity of the molecules, right? And the number of, if you think of any of the pharma companies, right? They have created this databases of millions and millions of molecules, and so it's the I'm thinking when you mean drug screening, you're talking about high content screening is the one that comes to mind. If that is not, is that the question? Is it high content screening you're talking about? Because it is a very key process in the drug development. Is that the question around?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, so that is, so for me, like I gave you the example of halicin, right? It's just that you have already all this database of millions of compounds, right? And then you are kind of trying to do this manual experiments, like you are manually looking at this, these images that you're analyzing these images manually, and you're taking images of various different experiments, and it just becomes almost infeasible to kind of look at it and do this manually. And so in terms of that, right, the high content screening actually is going through a lot of automation, because of people are trying different kinds of networks. The one I talked to you was about my multi-scale network, CNN, and so I think they're getting to a point where they could automate, right, much of this, and again go towards the compression of time that I mentioned, right? It's how do you kind of look at kind of reducing the time that is required to kind of manually look at all these different experiments that you have to do when you're doing drug screening. I mean, high content screening.
Yeah, we have Neha Mathur asking you to throw some light on how is the patient's data being used in AI. I guess she's talking about the privacy issue. Which could come in.
Yeah. Yes, surely. I mean, that's a very good one, Neha, because, I think that is where we need to do some more work, because, everybody wants to say that, it is at the end of the day, it's the patient's data, and it's patient has the right over the data. But the truth of the matter is today at this, I mean, there are laws. I mean, I can speak about what's happening in the US, but there is a lot of push in terms of their patients, being the owners of their data. There is something called the blue button approach, and where you can get your data. But at the same time, I still don't feel like we're at this point where, the patient knows exactly what's happening with their data, right? I mean, there is like a, opt-in, they have to have dynamic consent, right? That is taken for any studies that where you're going to use AI, you'll have to have some like kind of dynamic consent from the patient, that'll allow you to use their data, right? But the way AI is going, that is an area that needs more work, right? To ensure that the privacy of the patient is maintained. It's a big issue that people have to be looking at. There are processes like dynamic consent, but at the same time, AI is moving at such a fast pace that we need to keep an eye on that, right? The patient consent, on how where the data will be used and for what purposes.
We have Ashish asking the impact of AI in application development.
Impact of AI in application development. Let me try to answer one way, and you can tell me if that makes sense. Now, there is a lot of there's a lot of push towards open source right now. So where there has been kind of an explosion of innovation in the open source area when it comes to tools for for when you think about training or inferencing. In both areas, we have seen a lot of open source tools that are there to help you build your application without having to worry about the different things that you need. As long as you have picked up a framework to kind of work on, whether it's TensorFlow or PyTorch or so the different frameworks, as long as you can just write to your framework, everything else can be kind of there are enough things that are already being integrated into these frameworks for optimization, whether it's for training or for inferencing. So I would say that as an application developer, there are life is made a little more easier because most of the work is being done at the framework level, so that you don't have to kind of do that yourself, trying to put together all the libraries and for the different hardware targets, trying to understand what goes with what, right? You don't have to worry about all that. You just focus on at the framework level, is what I would say. And so companies like even Intel, even though we are not developing a framework, we are working with all the framework developers to kind of make sure that that we are building open source tools to kind of help them optimize the application for a given hardware.
We have another attendee asking, what's the scope for a tertiary educational institute to collaborate with industries in the AI research segment?
Tertiary institutions. I think I am trying to understand that question now. In tertiary institutions, does it mean health institutions, or I think there is a lot of work happening. If you think about hospital systems, right, I think many of the leading edge work today is happening with the academic institutions because they're able to kind of work on long range projects, and that is where we see a lot more experimentation happening. So I don't exactly know the scope of the question there, but what I see is that if you can find the academic institutions that are working on different whether it's different disease categories or different kinds of AI that they're experimenting with, I think I would encourage that. But I think the problem the one problem I would see is the data, right? The data continues to be an issue because even within academic institutions where they are very, they're looking for a long range and they're on really cool, innovative things, the problem comes back to data. How do we look at data that is so siloed today, right? You have data sitting in all these different institutions, unless you make it open source, there for all these hackathons and for the brats, the brain tumor segmentation, there were a lot of data sets out there. So unless you have somebody pooling all this data and kind of cleaning it up and having it ready, right, the data silo problem is a big problem. If anything, I would say that is where you may run into issues, is because people are very sensitive because of privacy and issues is one thing, but it's much more than that. There is no incentive for people to share the data, and without the data being shared, there is not much AI you can really do. And so in that sense, I would say you may run into issues with just the data, unless there are some, I mean, I don't know much about the tertiary institutions that you're talking about, but unless that you have something to offer, I think the problem you may run into is just using data from that the other institutions have.
Yeah, one question. Currently, India is going through the second wave of COVID.
Mhm.
How can Indian hospital system drive efficiencies and success with AI?
Yeah, and because I happen to be working with on a pandemic response team here in the US, right? We were looking at, and I shared with you some of these examples, right? And I think for the most part, if you think about everything else that is already kind of in progress, right now, whether it's the oxygen, the lack of oxygen or ventilator systems or the PPEs, these are things that needs to happen, and that seems like that's already kind of in being handled pretty well. I would say it is, again, comes back to education, and kind of also the telemedicine is going to be one place that we need to focus more, is that so that people don't burden the healthcare system because of the fears and because of things that they could be doing at home, right? That is where I would say telemedicine is one place, remote monitoring, home-based monitoring. These are areas that we could do more, so that we can try to address much of the problems that can be handled at home before they end up into the healthcare system, which is where where we are really short on resources and beds and so on, right? So that is one place I would say. And when I talk about telemedicine, I'm including the telehealth is one place where you're talking to a physician, but also I would include remote monitoring, or even kind of extending the ICUs beyond the hospital walls, right? I mean, I saw a lot of innovative ways of kind of people doing it, but there are companies like Medical Informatics is a company that we are working with, to create this virtual ICUs where you're kind of creating extra beds that are not necessarily within a hospital wall, right? Using the remote monitoring capability, we should look into that, right? How do we add more capacity for beds? How do we ensure that the hospital systems are not kind of overwhelmed? And also, one of the things that we should also look at is how do we get help from outside? Like, one of the places that I'm trying to work on is trying to see how do we get hospital the healthcare professionals who can kind of provide help remotely, right? We don't have that ability to do that today in India unless they're medical licensed for Indian system, right? And that is where I would say there is a policy work that needs to happen, so to make sure that we open up so that people can remotely help, at least at a secondary level, not the primary level, but at a secondary level where they can kind of share the load that is on the healthcare system right now. I don't know if I answered your question, but that is that are a couple ideas there.
Yeah, hi Hema, this is Vishal here. I just wanted to know, do we have any real life success story where AI has helped the medical fraternity in this pandemic situation?
Yeah, and that one, right? Like I'll go back to what I said, right? Sometime before, because before even AI shows up, right, there has to be the thought process on how you develop something like this, right? Like you need to have, it's not like a side project that you do somewhere, right, within a company in some corner. It has to be an executive level buy-in. The investment should be there to kind of bring in the infrastructure, put in all the processes in place, make sure we have the right data. And when we do all this, right, and at some point when you do that, then you're ready to go at scale to address a problem, right? And I will just share with you a story of one such hospital system in New York, right? It's a Montefiore health system. It was hit actually really badly during COVID, and there was there is a very brilliant team that has been working on kind of creating this before even thinking of the AI pipeline, right? How to create all the data pipelines in place and get the necessary processes in place and the automation, all of that, and then bring AI to bear, right? So they have been working on something like this for a few years. And when COVID hit, it is those institutions who had things in place that were able to kind of turn around and do something. Like, for instance, they were able to put together situational awareness systems, using understanding, take their models and kind of, fit it for COVID disease, and then look at the situational awareness from which they could look at their patients and say which of these patients will go into intubation, who will need intubation, who will develop acute respiratory diseases, who will not make it. This ability to kind of really efficiently manage that was able only because they put all of these systems in place much before COVID arrived. So if we have to look into the future, we have to have a very systematic way of kind of knowing what do we need, to address the next pandemic, right? Because it is doable. I mean, there is always some newness to the fact that COVID, we had never seen this, the disease before. So there was some newness to it, but the ability with which they were able to set up things and move fast is possible by companies that had already put the investments in place, and it's doable. And so, if anything, I continue to kind of look for, helping understand what are the things that needs to be in place for kind of, addressing the next pandemic, right? Because there are places where it can help. Yeah, I can surely help.
Thanks, Hema. We have a question from Lakshmi Jagannathan. She's asking the role of Intel in the support ecosystem in terms of, the Indian AI startups.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Lakshmi. Good question. Actually, Intel has it's got an partner ecosystem program. It's called the Intel Partner Alliance Program. And then there is also the Intel capital investments for if there is a need for capital investment. But I would say that it's the Intel Partner Alliance Program that is kind of, it's combining all the other programs we had in place. We had something called the AI Builder Program, meant only for startup communities. Now it's become part of the Intel Partner Alliance, and there is a version of that for Indian community, Indian startups. So I will have to connect you with the team that drives that part of the Partner Alliance Program for Indian startups, and that's an action item that I can take and share that with Ram and with you.
Jasir, do we have time or for any more questions?
Hi, can you hear me? Pawan here.
Yeah, go ahead, Pawan.
Hi, Hema. Thank you very much for the presentation and the insights. I just have one question. So you had mentioned that if you don't do AI right, there could be damages done. I was curious on, can you share some examples on things went south with the AI implementation and the decisions were taken wrong? Especially, I'm curious on the severity it can cause in a healthcare system.
Yeah.
So we have some examples of that. Thanks.
Yeah, I can share that. Thank you, Pawan. I mean, remember I mentioned, there is the algorithm design itself, right? That's something that we should think about. But so I'll talk to you about two examples, right? Like, one is where the system, the EGFR is an example I mentioned, the system that has got embedded guidelines for helping clinicians make decisions, right? So the decision making tools that are embedded inside these systems are sometimes, they use some proxies, now race as a proxy to kind of help them make some decisions, right? But those are things that I would say that we need to relook at. Now, there is one such an example, but there's something called WBAC, which is VBAC, which is vaginal birth after cesarean. Now, this one is another guideline that was part of the system, what that means is people who get vaginal birth is kind of very limited when it comes to minority population. The number of vaginal births that happen are limited. That is because, again, of a guideline that was meant to be a proxy to kind of add efficiency. But what it ended up, when you do a study, it shows that it invariably hurts the minorities. They end up getting more cesareans than vaginal births, and they have traced it back to that guideline. So I would say one of the places where, if we want to get AI right, is that, but because we are seeing that if you end up using systems with such embedded guidelines that could be proxies for something, it could hurt whatever AI you develop after that. Where we have seen a big problem in 2019 is where well-intentioned people were trying to look and say, who in the system needs more care. Okay, it's a very simple problem that people were looking at. Who in this system need care? And so they looked at the data and they used the proxy of saying who's spending more. If somebody is spending more money, that means they are using more of the healthcare system. That means they are the ones that need care. So this was the underlying design, right? But if you look at the reality of the situation, if you are poor and if you're a minority and you were afraid of the healthcare system, or if you could not access the healthcare system, you never made it into the healthcare data. So you never were there for other reasons. It's not because you were not sick. It was just that you were not in the system. And what then happened is that you ended up seeing people who were there in the system that were paying, but in reality, they did not need the care. They did not need the care the most. So it kind of gave the wrong analysis, right? Wrong outcome. The people who needed the care the most were never in the system and they never got the care. But the algorithm said that here is the people who are in the system, they're using the system the most, and so they need the care. And so the design of the algorithm, even though it was meant for something very, very, very benign purpose, it ended up coming with the wrong outcome, because it goes back to what is the data in the system? Is it balanced? What is the data we are looking at? And and so on, right? So that's an example.
Thanks, Hema.
One question. What are the job opportunities available in AI, especially in the healthcare industry? So what students want to do after the graduation or post-graduation?
In the healthcare, right now the curriculum is being looked at, like trying to say, okay, I can tell you a few things that we are doing, and it may not be exhaustive, right? But some of the things that we are seeing is we are trying to help create we're trying to help with the development of curriculum, so that clinicians who are kind of going through the normal curriculum will come out knowing a little more about healthcare. A little more about AI. Again, going back to how do we interpret AI in their regular workflow, right? So those are things that we are trying to kind of work with associations like American Medical Association, so that they can, because they are the ones that are speaking with the medical community, and so we are able to kind of work with them and kind of help them understand how AI, just the education aspect of it, right? And then kind of building that slowly into the curriculum. That is something that we are doing. But to your question, I'm thinking you may be trying to say, what is the scope? I think if you are able to kind of, augment if you're a healthcare person and you're able to augment, some of this analytics, without having to do pure, all complete data science, right? some understanding of, how AI is being used within the health applications, I think that it will go a long way to kind of adding more opportunities for you in the future, because here are some areas, right? Like if you don't have to be just a practicing clinician, right? Whether you are in a drug development, you will need you'll need that combination domain expertise, right? The clinical domain expertise plus the computational. So if you're able to, augment your capabilities, it will be opportunities not just as a healthcare professional, it will be in your scientific research, in drug development, or, if you think about any company right now, like the companies that I've talked to you about, GE's, Siemens, and Philips and other companies, right? They are looking for the people who have both the medical expertise and the computational background, right? So you can go into, and even companies like Intel, you'll be surprised, but even companies like Intel that are not doing pure healthcare, like, we are not clinicians, but we have clinicians who we are hiring, so they can help us kind of, think through from a clinician perspective. So you will find opportunities in technology companies, in now Google, think Amazon, everybody is trying to get into healthcare right now, right? So there will be opportunities to kind of, whichever way you're thinking, whether it's, healthcare, complete healthcare and augmenting some computational, or pure computational, trying to augment some healthcare background. Either way, you will find a lot of opportunities in pure health companies, or in drug development companies, pharmaceutical companies, or within the technology companies themselves. So there's a lot of opportunity. If anything, I see this intersection of biology and compute is going to be kind of a place where you will see a lot of gains in the future. So that intersection, wherever you are, I think you'll benefit.
I guess we're out of time, and it's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Hema, and thanks everybody for having joined us.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Yeah, it was good talking to all of you. Thank you. Thank you for attending. Bye now.